Hi, this is Kirby Summers, and I welcome you to my true crime podcast. Today, I'm going to be describing what continuity of government means, how we have dealt with it historically, because when I logged on to my social media this morning, there were all kinds of conflicting reports that either Joe Biden had died, that there's continuity of power, that this following the report that he had contracted COVID once again, and all sorts of rumors flying left and right. And I think few people understand continuity of government. So before I get started, I want to thank those of you who are new to my channel and give you guys that like the podcast another big thank you, because it does help with the algorithm on this platform. So as many of you know, Biden tested positive following an event on Wednesday, July 17th. Let me just make sure of that day. Yes, July 17th. He had been experiencing mild symptoms. Initially, he was supposed to return to his house in Delaware, where he was going to self-isolate. However, at the time, it was reported that the White House would provide regular updates and that he would continue to carry out the full duties of the office while in isolation. When he boarded the plane, he gave a thumbs up to the reporters, and then he wasn't wearing a face mask. He wasn't doing anything of the sort when he boarded Air Force One. In the meanwhile, as we all know, he stepped out of the race and basically passed off the torch to Kamala Harris. However, these reports that he's been dead, that we're going to hear that he's dead, that there's continuity of power. So it's my understanding that he's gotten a lot of that he's gotten a lot of medication, let's just call it, because I just don't want to go into names on this platform. And according to the most recent mainstream media report, his symptoms have almost completely resolved. And this is according to a White House press release just issued. So it does not say that he's dead. It does not say that there's a continuity of power. However, what to know about continuity of power? Clearly, if a president is either assassinated or dies unexpectedly or is incapacitated in any way, the government has in place something called continuity of government. So, for example, when President Trump contracted, the virus, and he was working from Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, people just didn't understand what was going to happen because there was a lot of uncertainty around the COVID issues. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson also had a bout with the virus, and it put him in intensive care. In that case, there was no formal provision for a temporary transfer of power. So what Johnson did was he deputized Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab as his first Secretary of State. And at the time, nobody really even understood what the authority that was passed on to Raab was or was not. However, in the United States, the 25th Amendment says, and it doesn't answer all the questions, by the way. It was, the 25th Amendment provides a mechanism for filling a vacancy. All right. The amendment was ratified in 1967 in the wake of Vice President Lyndon Johnson's accession to the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which basically left no vice president, right? Because he was the vice president under Kennedy. Kennedy was assassinated. He quickly became the president, leaving an office completely open. This, however, has happened more than a dozen times since 1789. All right, so the 25th Amendment is there for just that scenario. However, later, when Gerald Ford replaced Spiro Agnew as vice president, things became a little hazy. When the amendment was ratified, meaning it was sort of tried to be made clearer, it addressed ways to deal with undefined presidential inability. So the president is unable to do X, Y, and Z because of either he's incapacitated, he's in a hospital, who makes the decision, so on and so forth. So in Article 2 of the Constitution, it basically says, in case of the removal of the president from office or his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president, meaning that, as what happened with JFK's assassination, all of the powers vested in the president of the United States fell onto the vice president, who then ascended into becoming the president, okay? So that we're going to go back at the 1787 Constitutional Convention. John Dickinson did ask, well, what is the extent of the term disability? Who gets to be the judge of it? These are good questions, because not everything is the death of a president. Sometimes it's, as what's happened with Biden, he's incapacitated for a period of time, okay? And then Dickinson also wanted to know, well, who's going to be the judge of this? Who decides what incapacitated means, right? At that time, the delegates adjourned for a week to sort of ponder that question. But here's the kicker. They never went back to the table with a resolution, right? So it left it quite open, so that we have what we see on social media. Social media, I have to use Professor Hamamoto's term, pop-up pundits, saying, well, the president is dead, or all kinds of conspiracy theories, talking about the continuity of government, so on and so forth. Okay, well, again, the 25th Amendment is very clear as to whether a president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. So it's either the president or the vice president and the cabinet. So basically, the people that make the determination as to whether or not the president is capable or incapable is either to the president himself, to the vice president, and if necessary, by Congress. Clearly, it has to be if it's the president and or the vice president, it has to be bolstered by the cabinet. If that's insufficient at the time, then you need Congress to sort of make the final decision. The amendment, however, does allow the presidents to declare their own temporary disability and then to rescind it, then to basically say, I'm fine. Maybe the president was undergoing surgery, or maybe something else happened. So it allows the president, the sitting president, to basically say, I'm fine. So for example, Ronald Reagan in 1985 and George W. Bush in 2002 and in 2007 transferred power to their respective vice presidents for several hours at a time before undergoing surgical procedures that incapacitated them because they were under anesthetic, like they were like put out for the term of their surgeries. All right. So, and if we take another example, we can look at President Dwight Eisenhower, who suffered a stroke in late 1957, following a heart attack in 1955. And then he had surgery for an intestinal blockage in 1956. And then he wrote to Vice President Richard Nixon to say he would let Nixon know when to step up as acting president, and he would be the one to determine if and when it is proper for him to resume his duties. That was Eisenhower to Nixon, basically letting him know that, you know what, I'll be deciding this. You will not be making the decision. I'm going to decide it. Okay. So if the president, for example, cannot make such a declaration of whether or not he's incapacitated, is either going to hand off his power to his vice president, then the majority, the principal officers of the executive departments make that decision. They certify whether or not the president is unable, has no capacity to make that decision. So, and everything has a specific meaning. So then but it doesn't clarify. So constitutionally, what does the term inability? So that has never been defined, other than clearly if someone is dead, right? Inability, the term inability itself in the Constitution was never defined. And it was said to be, for years now, clearly, that was intentional. Since the amendment and the drafters were concerned that advances in medical technology as we moved through time could basically override the terminology that they selected for the 25th Amendment. So basically, it wasn't that they were lazy or that they were incapable or inept to basically finish defining that term. A professor of law by the name of Brian Kalt wrote, "The amendment is meant to transfer power swiftly when the president is completely incapacitated." So basically he wrote, think coma, serious stroke, severe dementia. Should the president recover, the decision to transfer power can be rescinded by the president's own written declaration that no inability exists. However, it does say written declaration. I have not seen anything other than something on a social media accounts stating that Biden rescinded or transferred power. But we're talking about continuity of government, which I think most people, because it doesn't happen very often, and the examples that we have are in the past, even though during Trump's presidency, that question did arise as well. So there's another scenario. So what if the president and the vice president become incapacitated? So in 1947, the Presidential Succession Act provides that the Speaker of the House serves as the president. However, the 25th Amendment, again, did not address the question of whether a living vice president could be considered incapacitated and or how that would be determined. So then there's another scenario. So the question then becomes, could the president be removed from power without his consent? Well, I would call that a coup. You would call that a coup. And frankly, we had a coup. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was a coup that happened before our very eyes, right? So in this, but we're talking about dying natural death, something other than a coup. So in the scenario of, can the president really be removed from power without his consent? If he does not declare a disability because he cannot, and or he will not because he is stubborn, right? So an example would be Eisenhower. After he suffered his stroke, Eisenhower wanted to still attend a state dinner that evening. He had a shouting match with his family, screaming, "There's nothing the matter with me. I'm perfectly all right." Talk about denial. You just suffered a stroke and you are, so basically, in my opinion, that is directly something that I personally would think that he was incapacitated because he cannot think straight. If you just suffered a stroke and you want to attend, I'm sorry, you want to attend a state dinner and then you have a shouting match with your family, I am perfectly all right. Well, no, you're not. So now my thing, if I had been there at the time, I would have looked at him and said, well, gee, you know what? You're not. And now you're showing me that you have mental issues and that you're impaired and you cannot make this decision. So that's why basically the 25th Amendment is very difficult. It's got some loopholes. And as I said earlier, these are intentional loopholes because medicine was always believed to be a growing field and that new answers would come in. However, Section 4 of the 25th Amendment matches a process to the possibility of whether or not somebody like Eisenhower, who wanted to attend a state dinner. So in that scenario, the vice president and the cabinet sent a declaration of disability to Congress. So basically, they can override what the president says if he is saying something that sounds as absurd as what Eisenhower said, right? So if the president then pushes back and says, no, I have no disability, then the vice president and the cabinet have 4 days to certify their belief that the president is unable to do the job, okay? So Congress would, at that moment, step in, make the decision. 2/3 of both of the House and the Senate, however, have to confirm and affirm that the president is indeed disabled. And then handing the president's duties to the vice president. It's a very high bar, okay? So, and it goes beyond what's required for impeachments because you are handing over the president who is basically saying, I'm fine, but they're taking the matters into their own hands and they're deciding, well, no, you know what? You're not fine. And we are going to do what is called a continuity of government, even though you are insisting that you're fine when clearly your medical record states otherwise. All right. So basically, the discretion that's vested in the vice president and the cabinet is less empowering than, say, than how it sounds. So vice presidents from Chester Arthur, who was the vice president for James Garfield, and then Thomas Marshall, who was the vice president for Woodrow Wilson, all the way to Richard Nixon, have felt that the thinnest of lines separated continuity of government from coup, right? That there was a very thin line that they recognized what could be viewed by the American public to represent a coup. In hindsight, again, going back to the JFK assassination, we know there was a coup, and Johnson had to have been in on it, right? In hindsight, with all of the many decades that have gone by, we can now, but when it's happening for the vice presidents of these that find themselves in this situation, they have to worry about their legacy, how they're going to be perceived, and how they're going to be perceived in that moment should they ascend into the presidency, when the president himself is basically saying, I'm fine, right? So in Marshall's case, who was, again, the vice president under Woodrow Wilson, he was so concerned about being thought of as a usurper of power that he was very relieved when Wilson's inner circle lied about his stroke in 1919. So they were afraid that, you know, things were very unstable. And so they lied to him. Think about it. So he really was incapacitated. He had a debilitating stroke in 1919. However, people were afraid to ask about it because no one wanted to believe or feel that he was going to be looked at as having been part of a coup, right? And so politicians and politics are still very tricky. You know, nothing is that clearly defined. So there's a book that came out in 2019. The title of it is Unable. And basically that book refers not just to a president, but to the fact that a dysfunctional president's opponents will be unable to use Section 4 as easily as they might like. So so that basically the 25th Amendment, it basically does rest largely on the president realizing that he must be able to understand the gravity of his own disability. All right. However, if he cannot, then at least the 25th Amendment does provide alternatives. They're not the best alternatives. People are, after all, people. They have their own concerns for their own legacy. And, you know, who knows what's really going to happen in any scenario, because as we have seen by looking at history, even the doctors will lie about the status of a president so that there is no continuity of power. Okay, guys, I hope that this resolves the issue about what is continuity of power legally as it is defined in the 25th Amendment. Do me a favor, give this a like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.